They got the house. She got a cracked piano. Inside was a fortune no one knew about. When Sydney Marsh signed the papers that gave away every stick of furniture she'd chosen over 18 years of marriage, her mother-in-law handed her one thing in return: an old upright piano with a crack running down its front panel, the kind of piano nobody wants, the kind you pay someone to haul away. Bettina Trent called it a parting gift. Sydney's daughters watched their grandmother say it with a straight face. What none of them knew, not Bettina, not Marcus, not the family that walked away with the house on Wrenfield Court, was that inside that piano sat something that would turn Sydney's whole life around in a season and leave the people who mocked her without a single word to say for themselves. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The house on Wrenfield Court had been Sydney's for 18 years. She knew the exact spot on the hallway floor where the boards gave a little under bare feet. She knew which kitchen cabinet door didn't quite latch and had to be nudged shut with a hip while your hands were full. She'd repainted the girls' rooms 3 times between them, chasing whatever color Harlow or Poppy had decided that year was the only acceptable one. She'd put in the flower bed along the side fence herself, on her knees in June heat, and watched the coneflowers come back every summer since. She left all of it: the flower bed, the repainted rooms, the kitchen table with the water ring near the edge that she'd always meant to sand out and never did. She left because the house wasn't hers on paper, not really, not in the way that held up when a marriage ended and lawyers got involved. Marcus Trent's name was the one on the deed. His mother had made sure of that back when they'd first bought the place, back when Sydney was 26 and grateful and hadn't thought to ask the kind of questions a person learns to ask later. Sydney was 44 now. She had a 16-year-old daughter named Harlow, who noticed everything and said little, and an 8-year-old named Poppy, who noticed everything and said all of it, usually at volume. She had a rented duplex on the other side of Larkspur Hollow with thin walls and a landlord who took 11 days to fix anything, and she had a checking account that had thinned out fast during the separation, the way money does when you're the one holding 2 kids together while the other adult in the room decides he's done holding anything. Marcus had moved out on a Thursday in February with the calm of a man who'd already made peace with a decision Sydney hadn't been part of. He went back to his mother's place first, then into an apartment near his office by April, and somewhere in that stretch of months he stopped being the person Sydney had built a life next to and became a name on custody paperwork instead. He wasn't cruel about the money. He simply wasn't generous with it either, and the settlement reflected the difference between what Sydney knew the marriage had actually been worth and what a judge decided it was worth on paper. The piano showed up on the day Sydney came to collect the last of her boxes from the house, 3 weeks after the divorce was final. Bettina Trent stood in the driveway with her arms crossed the way she'd stood in that driveway for 18 years, watching Sydney load her own belongings into a rented van like she was checking an inventory against a list only she could see. "We thought you should have this," Bettina said, nodding toward the old upright sitting on the porch, the crack down its front panel visible even from the driveway, one leg propped on a folded newspaper because it had lost its footing years ago and nobody had bothered fixing it. It was just sitting in the attic. Nobody plays it. Figured it'd mean more to you than to us. Sydney looked at the piano. She looked at Bettina. She understood the gift for exactly what it was, the same way she'd understood every small cutting thing Bettina had said to her over the better part of 2 decades, delivered with a smile, so nobody watching could call it what it actually was. "Thank you," Sydney said, because there wasn't a version of this moment where arguing changed anything, and because her daughters were in the van behind her, and she didn't want them carrying this particular memory any further than they had to. She had it loaded onto the back of the rental van by a man named Kurt from 2 streets over, who did odd hauling jobs for $20 and didn't ask questions about why a woman was crying quietly while she supervised the loading of a piano nobody in that family had touched in a decade. Sydney wasn't crying about the piano. She was crying about the flower bed and the hallway floorboard, and 18 years reduced to a driveway inventory and a broken instrument handed over like a joke. Only one person in the yard was on. Harlow, in the passenger seat, watched her mother climb in and pull the door shut without a word. Poppy, in the back, had her face pressed to the window, watching the house shrink behind them. "Are we keeping the piano?" Poppy asked. "I don't know yet," Sydney said, which was true in more ways than she understood that afternoon. She pulled out of the driveway on Wrenfield Court for the last time, and she did not look in the rearview mirror, and she had no idea that the ugliest thing anyone had ever handed her was about to become the reason none of them would ever have to worry the way they were worried that day again. The duplex on Larker Street had 2 bedrooms, which meant Harlow and Poppy shared one and Sydney took the other, a room barely big enough for the full bed and a dresser with a drawer that stuck if you pulled it wrong. The walls were the color landlords choose when they want to spend as little as possible and call it neutral, a beige that showed every scuff. The kitchen had a window over the sink that looked out onto the parking lot instead of a yard, and Sydney stood at that window more nights than she planned to that first month, washing dishes slowly because it gave her hands something to do while her mind worked through numbers that didn't add up the way she needed them to. Kurt and his nephew got the piano through the front door on the second try, after they'd taken the legs off and turned it sideways and scraped a chunk of paint off the doorframe that Sydney would owe the landlord for eventually. It ended up against the living room wall, under the window, taking up nearly a third of the room. Poppy thought this was thrilling. She sat on the bench the first night and pressed down on a few keys, and half of them answered with a real note, and the other half answered with a dull, muted thud, strings gone slack or hammers gone soft with age. "It's broken," Poppy announced, like she was the first to discover it. "Parts of it," Sydney said. "Parts of most things are broken. Doesn't mean the whole thing is." She didn't know why she said it. It came out of her the way things came out of her lately, half aimed at her daughter and half aimed at herself, a sentence doing 2 jobs at once. Harlow didn't touch the piano that first night. She sat on the floor against the far wall with her knees pulled up, watching her sister experiment with the keys, and said nothing for a long stretch of time. The kind of quiet that Sydney had learned over 16 years meant her older daughter was working something out privately before she'd let anyone see the shape of it. Then Harlow said, "We should get it tuned." "That costs money we don't have this month," Sydney said. "Not this month," Harlow agreed. Eventually became the operating word of that first stretch in the duplex. Sydney had $400 in savings after the deposit and first month's rent, and a part-time bookkeeping job she'd picked up from a friend of a friend who ran a landscaping company. 3 days a week, cash under the table because the owner didn't love paperwork and Sydney didn't love asking questions about it. It wasn't enough. It kept the lights on and put food on the table most weeks, but it left no room for anything eventual. She sold what she could. A set of dishes from her wedding registry that she'd never liked and kept anyway out of some sense of obligation to the person who'd given them. A box of clothes that hadn't fit in years and never would again. She picked up 2 more cleaning jobs through a woman at church, a house on Tuesdays and another on Fridays, scrubbing other people's kitchens for cash that went straight into an envelope in her sock drawer marked nothing, because naming what it was for felt like tempting something to go wrong before she got there. Poppy adjusted the way 8-year-olds adjust, which is to say almost entirely and almost immediately. Within 2 weeks, she'd made a friend in the unit next door, a girl named Dee whose mother worked nights, and the 2 of them ran back and forth between apartments with a freedom that made Sydney's chest tighten every time she thought about how easily Poppy had let go of Wrenfield Court. Harlow adjusted the way 16-year-olds adjust, which is slower, and mostly in private, behind a closed door, with music playing low enough that Sydney couldn't make out the words, but could hear the bass line through the wall some nights until well past when she should have told her to turn it off. Sydney started sitting at the piano herself in the evenings after the girls were asleep. Not to play, not really, she'd taken a handful of lessons as a kid and remembered almost none of it, but to press a few keys quietly and listen to which ones answered and which ones didn't. There was something in the repetition of it that settled her. The keys that worked were bright and true. The dead ones gave a hollow knock, would against felt, no ring to them at all. She found herself cataloging them without meaning to, the way she'd cataloged the boards in the hallway on Wrenfield Court, learning a new house through its failures the same way she'd learned the old one. It was on one of these nights, 3 weeks into the duplex, that she noticed the bench. The piano bench had a hinged lid, the kind meant to store sheet music, and when she lifted it she found exactly what she expected. A handful of yellowed music books, a stack of hymnal pages held together with a rubber band gone brittle with age, and a metronome missing its needle. Nothing unusual. She was about to close it when she noticed the bottom of the bench sat higher than the outside dimensions of the box seemed to allow, a gap of maybe an inch and a half between where the storage compartment ended and where the legs of the bench actually began. She sat there for a while with the lid propped open, looking at that gap, running her thumb along the seam where the false bottom met the sides. Before she reached for the flashlight, she kept in the kitchen drawer for power outages and came back to look closer. The flashlight beam caught the seam clearly once she angled it right. A thin line running the width of the bench, where a panel had been fitted and flush with the surrounding wood, close enough to pass for original construction unless you were looking for it the way Sydney was looking for it now. On her knees on the living room floor at 11 at night with both girls asleep down the hall. She pressed along the edge with her thumbnail and felt it give slightly on one side, a give that plain wood didn't have. She thought about waking Harlow. She thought about it for maybe 10 seconds and then decided against it. Not because she didn't want her daughter there, but because some part of her wanted to know what she was dealing with before she let anyone else's hope get tangled up in it. She'd learned that instinct the hard way over the last year, the instinct to check a thing twice before she let herself feel anything about it, because feeling things too early had cost her before. The panel came free with more effort than she expected, popping loose all at once after resisting for a full minute, and underneath it was a shallow compartment built into the base of the bench, maybe 2 inches deep, and running the full length of it. Inside were 3 things: a metal cash box, the kind with a small lock and a handle on top, rusted at the corners. A bundle of papers wrapped in a plastic sleeve, the kind of sleeve you'd get from an office supply store, gone slightly cloudy with age. And underneath both of those, wrapped in what had once been a dish towel and had gone stiff and yellow with time, something heavy enough that Sydney felt it shift against her palm before she'd even lifted the towel away. She sat back on her heels and looked at all 3 for a long moment without touching any of them again, the way you look at something you're not sure you're allowed to want yet. The cash box wasn't locked, or rather the lock had rusted enough that it gave when she pressed on it, and inside were bills, older bills, the kind with the smaller portraits and the different paper weight, folded in bundles of 10 and secured with string instead of rubber bands. She didn't count them that night. She told herself she'd count them in the morning when her hands weren't shaking and her judgment was better, but she did flip through enough of the bundles to understand that this wasn't pocket change somebody had tucked away for a rainy day. This was the kind of money a person hides on purpose, over time, with intention. The papers in the plastic sleeve were harder to make sense of at 11 at night with a flashlight and a heartbeat she could feel in her ears. There was a folded document that looked legal, typed on a machine rather than printed, the kind of formatting that told her it was old, decades old at least. There was a photograph, black and white, going soft at the corners, of a woman standing beside this same piano in what looked like a different room entirely, wallpaper Sydney didn't recognize, a window shape that didn't match anything in the Trent family's current house. And there was a letter, handwritten, the ink faded to a pale brown, folded in thirds the way people used to fold things before they put them in envelopes. The object under the dish towel was a ring, heavy, gold, set with a stone large enough that Sydney's first instinct was to assume it was costume jewelry, glass dressed up to look like something it wasn't, because the alternative felt like more than she was prepared to hold at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday in a rented duplex with her daughters asleep down the hall. She didn't sleep much that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the 3 items arranged in front of her, the cash box open, the letter unfolded as carefully as she could manage without tearing the creases, and she read it twice before she let herself believe what it seemed to be telling her. The handwriting was a woman's, careful and old-fashioned, addressed to nobody by name, more like a note left for whoever eventually found it than a letter meant to be mailed. It mentioned a name Sydney didn't recognize. Eugenia. It mentioned the piano specifically, called it hers, said it had come from a mother and would go to a daughter, and that what was hidden inside it was meant to stay hidden until it was needed by someone who needed it, not someone who simply wanted it. Sydney read that line 3 times. Someone who needed it, not someone who simply wanted it. She thought about Bettina in the driveway, arms crossed, calling the piano a parting gift with a straight face. She thought about how certain that family had been that they were handing her nothing, a broken instrument nobody wanted, a joke dressed up as generosity. She wondered, sitting there at 1 in the morning with a 100-year-old letter in her hands, whether Bettina had any idea what she'd actually given away, or whether this had sat in that attic for years, decades maybe, waiting for someone who wasn't looking for a punishment to open it. She didn't know yet what any of it was worth. She didn't know if the ring was real, or the money was more than it looked, or the document meant what she thought it might mean. What she knew, sitting in the quiet of the duplex with the girls asleep and the parking lot lights coming in sideways through the kitchen window, was that she needed someone who'd know how to find out. Someone who understood old things and old money and old instruments well enough to tell her whether she was looking at a strange coincidence or the first real turn her life had taken in longer than she could remember. In the morning, she called Marion Holt. Marion Holt had taught piano out of her home on Chestnut Row for close to 40 years before her hands got too stiff for it, and half of Larkspur Hollow had sat on her bench at some point in childhood, including, as it turned out, Sydney's own mother, a fact Sydney hadn't known until she mentioned the piano over the phone, and Marion said, in the particular tone of someone placing a memory, that she remembered a Marsh girl from lessons decades back, and wondered if they were kin. They were. Sydney hadn't expected the conversation to open that door. And for a moment, standing in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and the coffee going cold on the counter, she felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the divorce was finalized, some small proof that she still belonged to something in this town beyond the version of her family that had just fallen apart. Marion came by that afternoon with her husband Dale driving, since her own license had lapsed 2 years back, and neither of them saw much point in renewing it for a woman who mostly stayed home now. She was 78, sharp-eyed, with the particular brisk warmth of a woman who'd spent 4 decades correcting children's posture and had never fully turned that instinct off. She looked at the piano for a long time before she touched it, running her fingers along the crack in the front panel, testing a few keys the way Poppy had, listening to which ones answered. "This is a Braddock," Marion said. "Nobody's made these since before the war. Good bones if somebody kept the soundboard dry." She looked at Sydney. "You said there was more." Sydney had already decided she wasn't going to hide anything, not from Marion, not after the woman had driven over on a Tuesday afternoon without asking a single question about why. She brought out the cash box, the papers, the ring, and set them on the kitchen table, and she watched Marion's face change as she looked at each one in turn, the brisk, teacherly warmth giving way to something more careful. "The letter first," Marion said. "May I?" She read it slowly, twice, the way Sydney had, her lips moving faintly over certain words. When she finished, she set it down and was quiet long enough that Dale, standing by the window, shifted his weight and glanced at his wife with the look of a man who knew when not to interrupt. "Eugenia Trent," Marion said finally. "I know that name. Not personally, she'd have been gone before my time, but my mother talked about her. There was a story in this town back when I was a girl about a woman who married into money and then watched most of it disappear before she did. Card debts, I think, or bad investments, something her husband did that she spent her whole marriage quietly working around. The story was she'd hidden things. Nobody ever proved it. Nobody ever found anything either, and the family that came after her always swore there was nothing to find." She looked at the ring. "I'd say somebody was wrong." Sydney felt the floor tilt slightly under a story she hadn't asked for, and now couldn't stop hearing. Eugenia Trent. Marcus's family, going back generations further than she'd ever bothered to trace. Because you don't trace a family you're planning to leave someday, you just live inside it. The piano hadn't come from nowhere. It had been sitting in that attic holding a secret that belonged, technically legally, to a family that had just spent 18 years making Sydney feel like she didn't belong to it at all, and they'd handed it to her as an insult without knowing what they were handing over. "The ring needs a jeweler," Marion said. "But I know somebody better suited to the piano itself, and to that document if it's what I think it is." She glanced at Dale. "Give Theo a call." Theo Callum ran a small shop 2 towns over that restored antique furniture and instruments, pianos mostly, though he'd take on the occasional grandfather clock if the owner was patient and the price was fair. Marion had known him for years, had sent him students' family pianos when they needed real work rather than a simple tuning, and she trusted his eye in a way she didn't extend easily to most people in the trade. He came out on a Thursday, 2 days later, in a truck with his name stenciled on the door and a level of quiet focus that reminded Sydney, though she wouldn't have put words to it that first afternoon, of the way a person looks at something they respect rather than something they're pricing. He spent nearly an hour with the piano itself before he even glanced at the papers on the table, running his hands along the soundboard, checking the pin block, tapping the crack in the front panel with one knuckle in a way that told Sydney he was listening for something the rest of them couldn't hear. When he finally sat down at the table and looked at the document Marion had flagged, his expression didn't change much, but he read it 3 times through, slower each time, and when he looked up at Sydney there was a different weight in his face than there'd been a minute before. "This is a deed," he said. "Or it was land, not money, though I'd want a lawyer to confirm it still means anything after this many years." He set it down carefully. "But if this parcel is what I think it is, and if nobody's touched the title since Eugenia held it, you might be sitting on something considerably bigger than a ring and a cash box." Sydney looked at the piano against her living room wall, the crack still running down its front panel exactly where it had been 3 days ago, and thought about how ordinary it had looked in that driveway on Wrenfield Court, and how little Bettina Trent had understood about what she was so pleased to give away. Marion's stories about Eugenia Trent didn't stop at the driveway conversation. Over the following week, she came by twice more, once with an old church directory from the Historical Society that listed the Trent family going back to the 1920s, and once with nothing more than her own memory, sharpened by 2 visits worth of thinking about it. She told Sydney that Eugenia had been known in Larkspur Hollow as a careful woman, the kind who kept her own accounts separate from her husband's without ever making a show of it, and that after her husband's business failed the second time, most people in town assumed the family had lost everything worth losing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Theo took the deed to a lawyer he trusted in the county seat, a woman named Priscilla Doss who handled estate and property matters for half the small towns in the region and had, according to Theo, a memory for old land records that bordered on unsettling. It took her 9 days to come back with an answer, 9 days during which Sydney went to work at the landscaping office and cleaned 2 houses and packed Poppy's lunches and helped Harlow study for a history test, doing all of it with a strange hum underneath her ordinary life, the sense of standing at the edge of something she couldn't yet name out loud, not even to her daughters. Priscilla's answer, when it came, was longer and more complicated than Sydney had braced herself for. The parcel described in the deed was 11 acres on the eastern edge of the county, land that had been Eugenia's separately from her husband's holdings, inherited from her own mother and never folded into the Trent family's later financial troubles because Eugenia had, in Priscilla's words, been smart enough or suspicious enough to keep it that way on paper. The land had sat untouched and untaxed under a trust structure so old that most of the county records office had forgotten it existed, which meant no one had paid property tax on it, which meant no one in 6 decades had noticed it wasn't theirs to ignore. It also meant the land, technically, belonged to whoever could establish themselves as Eugenia's rightful heir under the terms of that trust, and Eugenia's will, filed and buried in a county archive since the 1960s, was specific in a way that made Priscilla read the relevant passage to Sydney twice over the phone. The land and its contents, whatever remained of them, were to pass to the woman who held the piano, not the family who held the house. Not the family name. The piano. She wrote it that way on purpose, Priscilla said. I've read 100 of these old wills, and most of them are boilerplate. This isn't boilerplate. She knew exactly what she was doing when she put those words down. Sydney sat with that for a long time after she hung up the phone. She thought about the letter in the bench, the line about someone who needed it rather than someone who simply wanted it, and she understood now that Eugenia hadn't been writing a vague sentiment. She'd been writing instructions, aimed at whoever the family eventually handed that piano to out of contempt rather than care, because Eugenia had apparently understood something about her own descendants that had turned out to be true 2 generations later in a driveway on Wrenfield Court. The 11 acres weren't farmland anymore, not that they'd been particularly productive farmland, even in Eugenia's day. They sat along the eastern edge of the county where developers had spent the last 5 years buying up anything with road access and a decent water table, building the kind of subdivisions that were slowly turning Larkspur Hollow from a town people left into a town people moved to. Priscilla had already fielded one inquiry from a development company by the time she called Sydney back, a company that had apparently been watching that parcel for longer than Sydney had known it existed, waiting for someone to sort out the tangled ownership so they could make an offer. The offer, when it came 2 weeks later, was larger than anything Sydney had let herself imagine sitting at her kitchen table with a flashlight and a rusted cash box. She didn't say the number out loud when Priscilla told her over the phone, She wrote it down on the back of an envelope instead because saying it felt like it might make it stop being true, and then she sat at the table and looked at the number until Poppy came in from school and asked why she was crying at 4 in the afternoon over a piece of paper. Good crying, Sydney told her, which Poppy accepted without much further questioning, because 8-year-olds generally do. She told Harlow first, once Poppy was in bed, sitting on the edge of her older daughter's bed the way she used to when Harlow was small enough to need help falling asleep. Harlow listened to the whole thing without interrupting, the same quiet processing Sydney had watched her do since she was a toddler, taking information in fully before she let herself react to it. "So Grandma Bettina gave you a piano," Harlow finally said, "and it turned out to be worth more than the house she kept." "It looks that way," Sydney said. Harlow was quiet another moment. Then, for the first time in longer than Sydney could remember, her older daughter laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from someplace surprised and unguarded. And Sydney found herself laughing too, sitting on the edge of a twin bed in a rented duplex, over a piece of furniture nobody had wanted 3 weeks earlier. The ring went to a jeweler in the county seat that Priscilla recommended, a small shop that had been appraising estate pieces for 3 generations of the same family. And the answer came back within a week. The stone was a sapphire, not glass, old cut in a style the jeweler dated to sometime before 1930, set in gold that tested out at a purity common to that era, but rare in anything made today. It wasn't the centerpiece of what Sydney had found in that bench, not next to 11 acres of land a development company wanted badly enough to keep raising their offer. But it was real, and it was hers, and she found herself wearing it on a chain around her neck rather than selling it, the one piece of the whole discovery she decided to keep rather than turn into a number on a page. The cash box turned out to hold just over $11,000 in old currency, some of it collectible enough that a coin and currency dealer in Charlotte offered more than face value for certain bills, bundles that had sat wrapped in string since before Sydney's own mother was born. She kept some of that too, a handful of bills in a frame that now hung in the duplex hallway, not for the money but for the strangeness of it, proof that a woman 2 generations back had sat somewhere folding these bills into bundles with the specific hope that they'd end up exactly where they had. The land deal took longer to close than Sydney expected. 6 weeks of paperwork and title searches, and 1 meeting in Priscilla's office where a representative from the development company sat across the table and tried, politely but persistently, to talk the number down. Sydney sat through that meeting with her hands folded and let Priscilla do most of the talking, because Priscilla had done this 100 times and Sydney had done it exactly once. And by the end of it, the number hadn't moved much, because Priscilla had made clear from the start that her client wasn't in a hurry and didn't need to sell. It was during those 6 weeks that Theo started coming around more than the piano strictly required. He'd finished the structural work on it by the 2nd week, the crack in the front panel repaired, so while you had to know exactly where to look to find the seam, the dead keys brought back to life one by one until every hammer in that Braddock answered true when you pressed it. There was no reason for him to keep showing up after that, and both of them seemed to understand this without saying it out loud, which was maybe why he kept finding small reasons anyway. A part he wanted to double-check, a tuning that needed revisiting after the panel work settled, an invitation to bring the girls by his shop, where his daughter Junie was building a birdhouse out of scrap wood and could use company her own age. Poppy and Junie became fast friends in the way that children do when nobody's told them, yet that friendship requires more effort than simply liking someone. Harlow and Junie took longer, 12 and 16 being farther apart than 8 and 12. But by the 3rd visit to Theo's shop, Harlow had started asking Junie questions about the restoration work with real interest. And by the 4th visit she was sanding a drawer front alongside her, sawdust in her hair, looking more relaxed than Sydney had seen her look in over a year. Sydney and Theo talked while he worked, the way people talk when their hands are busy and neither one has to look directly at the other, which made certain things easier to say. He told her about his wife, gone 4 years now to an illness that had moved fast and left him raising Junie alone in the space of what felt, he said, like a single terrible season. Sydney told him about Marcus and the house, and 18 years of feeling like a guest in her own marriage without being able to say exactly why until it ended and she finally had room to look back and see the shape of it clearly. "You didn't need any of this to prove something," Theo said one evening, nodding toward the piano sitting finished and gleaming against her living room wall. The crack gone, the wood refinished to a warm honey color that made the whole instrument look decades younger. "You'd have been fine either way. You were already fine. Maybe, Sydney said. It didn't feel that way in the driveway. No, he agreed. It wouldn't. Word moved through Larkspur Hollow the way word moves through small towns, which is to say slowly at first and then all at once. And by the time the land deal closed, most people in town had heard some version of the story, most of it more exaggerated than the truth actually required. Bettina Trent heard it from her own sister, who'd heard it from someone at the beauty parlor, who'd heard it from Priscilla's assistant, who probably shouldn't have said anything at all. Sydney didn't hear about Bettina's reaction directly. She heard about it the way she heard about most things now, secondhand, filtered through people who'd been in the room or near enough to it. People who described an expression on Bettina's face that nobody could quite put into words, but that everyone agreed was worth having witnessed. Sydney didn't call her. She didn't feel the pull to explain herself or gloat or settle any old score across a phone line. She was too busy that month, closing on the land, meeting with Priscilla, sitting at her kitchen table working through numbers that had gone, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely in her favor. By late autumn, the 11 acres had closed for a figure that let Sydney do something she hadn't let herself imagine doing even in the weeks right after she'd found the compartment in the bench. She bought a house, not on Wrenfield Court, not anywhere near it, but on a quiet street called Birch Hollow Lane on the west side of town, a 3-bedroom with a real yard and a kitchen window that looked out on maple trees instead of a parking lot. She bought it outright, no mortgage, and stood in the empty living room the day she got the keys with Harlow and Poppy running through the bare room shouting about which one belonged to who, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't fully felt since before the divorce, maybe longer than that. She kept the bookkeeping job, though she cut back to 2 days a week instead of 3, and she kept cleaning Marion's modest little house on Chestnut Row on Tuesdays, not because she needed the money anymore, but because Marion had become something closer to family than employer, and neither of them wanted to lose the excuse to sit at Marion's kitchen table afterward drinking coffee and talking about nothing in particular. She set aside a portion of what remained for the girls' college accounts that hadn't existed a season earlier, and she set aside a smaller portion for herself, not spent, just there, a number in an account that meant she'd never again have to stand in a driveway and accept whatever anyone decided to hand her. The piano moved with them to Birch Hollow Lane, positioned this time not against a wall in a cramped living room, but in a proper front room with good light, and Sydney signed both girls up for lessons with Marion, who came out of a retirement she hadn't entirely wanted in the first place to teach 2 more students, this time for free, waving off Sydney's protests with the same brisk authority she'd used on 40 years of 8-year-olds who thought they could talk their way out of practicing. Scales. Poppy took to it the way she took to most things, loudly and without much patience for the boring parts, plunking out melodies by ear faster than she could read the sheet music for them. Harlow was slower and more careful, the way she was slow and careful about most things that mattered to her, and by December she'd worked her way through enough of a piece that she played it for the whole house one evening after dinner, a simple arrangement but clean, every note landing where it was supposed to land on a piano that had once had half its keys answering with nothing but a hollow, dead knock. Theo and Junie became fixtures at the house on Birch Hollow Lane in a way that happened so gradually nobody could point to the day it started. Sunday dinners first, then a standing arrangement where Junie came by after school on the days her father worked late, then something that didn't need a name anymore by the time winter set in fully, though nobody had rushed to put one on it. Sydney had learned, in the space of those months, that she wasn't in any hurry, that whatever this was with Theo could take exactly as long as it needed to take, and that the not hurrying was its own kind of peace after 18 years of pretending things were fine when they weren't. Bettina Trent sent a letter in January, 3 months after the land deal closed, the first direct communication Sydney had received from her since the driveway. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. It was 3 paragraphs of careful, formal language that skirted close to acknowledgement without ever quite arriving at it, ending with a line about how families should stay connected regardless of circumstances, and a request to see the girls sometime, if Sydney thought that would be appropriate. Sydney read it twice, then folded it and set it on the kitchen counter, and thought about it for several days before she answered. She wasn't interested in punishing Bettina the way Bettina had, whether she meant to or not, spent years quietly punishing her. She was interested in her daughters having whatever relationships they wanted with their grandmother, on their own terms, at their own pace, without Sydney standing in the middle of it managing old grievances that weren't theirs to carry. She wrote back a short, polite letter, said the girls could decide for themselves whether and when they wanted a visit, and left it at that. Harlow, when she heard about the letter, said she wasn't ready yet, maybe not for a while. Poppy, when she heard about it, mostly wanted to know if Grandma Bettina would ever find out about the piano being fixed, and seemed disappointed when Sydney explained that yes, she almost certainly already knew. The crack in the piano's front panel was long gone by then, sanded and refinished so completely that a person would have to know exactly where the seam had been to find any trace of it at all. Sydney thought about that sometimes, standing in the front room at Birch Hollow Lane listening to Poppy work through a piece with more enthusiasm than precision. How something handed over as a joke, a broken thing meant to say you deserve nothing more than this, had turned out to be the one object in her entire divorce that actually understood her worth better than any person in that family had. The Founders' Day celebration in Larkspur Hollow fell on the second Saturday of May, and that year the town council asked Marion Holt if any of her students would be willing to perform at the afternoon program, a tradition that usually pulled from whichever family happened to have a kid far enough along in lessons to get through a piece without stumbling. Marion suggested Harlow, who'd been playing for 7 months by then and had worked her way into pieces well beyond what most 7-month students could manage, mostly because she practiced with a discipline Marion said she hadn't seen in a student in years. Harlow said yes before Sydney had finished relaying the invitation, which surprised everyone in the house, including Harlow herself, who admitted afterward she wasn't entirely sure why she hadn't hesitated the way she usually hesitated about things that put her in front of people. The program was held on the courthouse lawn, folding chairs set out in rows facing a small temporary stage. The piano they were using trucked in and tuned that morning by Theo, who'd volunteered for the job the moment he heard the town's usual instrument had a sticking pedal nobody had gotten around to fixing. Sydney sat in the second row with Poppy on one side and Theo on the other, Junie next to her father, and watched Harlow walk up to that piano in a blue dress Sydney had bought her for the occasion, looking calmer than any 16-year-old had a right to look in front of half the town. She played a piece Marion had chosen for her months earlier, something by a composer Sydney couldn't have named before all of this started, and Harlow's hands moved over the keys with a steadiness that made Sydney's throat tighten somewhere around the second minute. There were a few small stumbles, the kind an audience mostly doesn't catch unless they're listening for them, and Sydney was listening for them, holding her breath through each one until Harlow found her way back into the piece without breaking stride. When it ended, the applause ran longer than Sydney expected for a courthouse lawn program, and Harlow stood and gave a small, awkward bow and found Sydney's eyes in the crowd before she stepped off the stage. Marion, sitting on Sydney's other side by then, leaned over during the applause. "That girl's got her grandmother's hands," she said, and for a moment Sydney thought she meant Bettina, until Marion clarified, "Your mother. I taught her to, remember? Same steadiness. Skips a generation sometimes." Sydney hadn't expected that, hadn't thought about her own mother in the context of any of this, and found herself blinking hard against the courthouse lawn sunlight for reasons that had nothing to do with the brightness of the day. The local paper ran a piece on the Founders' Day program the following Wednesday, 3 columns with a photograph of Harlow at the piano mid-performance, and buried in the third paragraph was a line about the instrument itself, a restored antique upright with what the reporter called an unusual history, on loan for the day from a Larkspur Hollow family. The reporter hadn't gotten the full story, hadn't known about the bench compartment or the deed or the 11 acres, only that the piano had recently come to some prominence in town, and that its owner had asked, when contacted for comment, to keep the rest private. Sydney had asked for exactly that, told the reporter over the phone that the story wasn't really about money or land, that if there was a story in it worth telling, it was about a piano nobody wanted turning out to be worth more than anyone imagined, which happened to be true in more ways than the reporter had space to print. Bettina read that piece too, the way she'd read about the land deal months earlier, and this time she called instead of writing a letter, and Sydney answered because Poppy was standing right there asking who was calling, and Sydney didn't see the sense in avoiding it forever. The conversation was short, awkward in places, warmer than Sydney expected in others, and it ended with Bettina asking, in a voice that sounded smaller than the one Sydney remembered from that driveway, whether she might come to the next recital, if there was one, just to watch from the back. Sydney said that would be fine. She meant it, mostly, in the way you can mean something and still feel the old scar tissue pull a little when you say it. That evening, after the girls were in bed, Sydney sat at the piano in the front room at Birch Hollow Lane, Theo beside her on the bench, and pressed a few keys the way she had that first night in the duplex, listening to each one answer true. No hollow knock left anywhere in the instrument. She thought about the driveway on Wrenfield Court, the crack running down the panel, Bettina's straight face, saying nobody plays it. Figured it'd mean more to you than to us. If you have ever been handed something meant to diminish you and found, underneath it, something nobody expected you to find. If you have ever watched your children build a life out of the very thing someone else tried to use against you, this story belongs to you too. Because Sydney didn't just fix a broken piano. She rebuilt a life note by note, compartment by compartment, one true key at a time, and nobody who watched her do it will ever call that ordinary. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the things people give you to diminish you can become the things that define you. That starting over is not the same as starting from nothing. That a cracked piano in the right hands is enough to hold an entire fortune, and an entire future besides. We are deeply grateful you walked this road with us today. We'll see you in the next story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.